in the village. She has never gone to school, but she's Minister for Environment, trying to conserve the living because we have unique droughts. And part of that time of drought, if you don't have mangoes, then you are very acute famine. And because of the need for charcoal, for burning bricks, we're cutting down mangoes. So the local community has had to set out laws and put the Minister of Environment. But the farming has changed. They have all organized themselves to explore local market opportunities. But suddenly, millet is not a food for the people to create. People don't have millet. Millet is for making food, for drinking, and malnutrition is not that. It is a situation where the population has more than tripled. You go to the village, all the market days will find you from it. The best thing that we have got is mobile telephones. So colleagues, things have changed. Africa's different. How do we harness the opportunities to make a difference? If you have a burial function, everybody comes, you see the population changing, then you know the economy is growing. And you see a country like Uganda, which has one of the best weather, according to many colleagues in South Africa, cannot feed itself, cannot move food from one place to the other. But it has a population. Ladies and gentlemen, with those remarks, I would not like to address the topic. It's about investing in potential. I've told you that in potential. We must make the potential right. But that is the idea of Africa and land and feed the world. That's what the education are. But are we actually in a position to feed the world? Let's get it back to the statistics that have been mentioned in the country. Really, we are the rapid expected to triple. In some part, the majority are getting very, very old, except in Africa, where you have a youthful population. Will we be able to feed that population? And the feeling that the country, the continent with the highest potential to feed that population, if it imagines its own growth, is Africa. Put differently, you will see those dark parts in the slide amidst the population that you have in Europe, in America, you will see a very large part of aging population. But in Africa, you basically have 60% of the population aging. So the issue then becomes how does it turn that population into a contributor to development? I think that is the challenge that we have. People are seeing this as one of the biggest evidence that the continent has. But we must be able to nurture it, to make sure that they benefit, that they see value for themselves, and that they add to economic development. Otherwise, I must say, we're heading to disaster. I don't know if it's
sitting in the
come
conference.
from Uganda, we're just
I've
starting
seen
out
the
things.
email about the stream we did this morning.
It's a country that moved from a population of 8 million within 15 years.
Yeah, I did send it to them. I'm going to send you the link. I'm using YouTube. I'm going to send you a link. I've actually taken a picture, so I'm just going to forward you that.
So,
Towards your email.
you look at the world from the
Yeah,
map.
it is.
It is
Yes.
but
Okay, I'll send you.
our capacity to increase productivity to feed the world is actually at a
I'm gonna send.
declining rate.
I'll send you that email.
It was at about
Yeah, I'll send you that email they sent to me.
around the 1950s. Now it is almost about 7.5%. And that increase was largely from the advancement in Europe, probably in the Asia, and Latin America. But I think we have the problem of how to cope with population and then our ability to feed the world. So, the potential of Africa. I'm assuming this is the Africa we have been talking all about. It's not difficult. Like Kenya, we have this diverse. So when we're talking about the potential here, right now, let me focus on three things. We look at the issue of land availability, we look at the issue of water availability, and then we would like to relate them to agriculture and see where are the potentials. The dark fields are the countries we have the largest availability of land in the continent. And generally speaking, the water availability to some extent is also there. That's where you have the potential in terms of land, and to a limited extent also in terms of water availability for all those countries. Then you will see the more or less what we call the dark brown and all that. That's basically where there is at least an opportunity for expansion in land. So we need to do other things for those countries to be able to give enough food and add innovations to be able to feed. Then you see that unit, like we say, around one is where you have Botswana. Really, water is a key factor. Botswana, you have Somalia, and all of those countries, but really, water is a major factor. Very big. Likewise, North Africa, the potential is there, but you have the problem of lack of water. Then you come back home, South Africa. It's the land there. But you have one thing. You have a strong science base that can actually make use of the little that is there, that can take advantage of the early situations to enable you to produce much more to feed a larger population. I wanted to tell you something else about that. I had the opportunity to travel between Khartoum and Kordofan. Kordofan is Mrs. who was in charge of the conflict. When you travel and you look around, your eyes will be as far as you want. You see this land, you see the availability of land. And actually you can see land is actually there. But how do you turn that land to be able to deliver to feed the world? First you must have the base. Then you must have the science, technology, innovation to make sure you harness that opportunity. So all this, we are very varied scenarios that will require different sorts of innovations to turn innovation into reality so that we can feed ourselves. Having enough land, like piece of land, is not enough. You must make it productive while at the same time ensuring environmental health and sustainability. Agriculture, we briefly talked about that. I really want again appreciate the previous speakers. Look at that land availability, and then you suddenly realize that most of the land is actually held by the smallholder farmers, and very, very little is the large-scale farmers. So that has policy implication in terms of how you invest, how you turn those small lands into more productive land, how you turn them so that they are able to contain the large population that is here. Of course, you have experiences from Japan, where you can actually have a small land and actually be productive. So the science that underpins development must look at how we may enhance productivity and sustainability within this smaller order agriculture. But that smallholder agriculture is again affected by another factor, another serious factor, the population growth. You cannot keep on going and just subdividing. And moreover, the majority of the people youth population So you find that you have the dilemma that you must really deal with. And the population dynamics, gender dynamics. You find that Africa is beginning to face what Latin America has already faced. The majority of farmers are the old, not the young people. So we have that challenge again, how to track the young people into farming, to make it farm in a way that the same handle of the disease. So that's the challenge. In terms of meeting food cycle, the total factor productivity is pretty low in Africa compared to everywhere. Elsewhere, it's very, very low. So again, how we can increase total factor productivity in Africa is an issue that we must deal with if we are going to ensure food and nutritional security. So, when do we get the food supply? It's what is the scenario globally. Previously, it was largely North America, but one sees very limited growth coming from that area moving forward. Very, very limited. We saw increases in India and the Far East. I think the potential is still there. The other bigger potential was from Brazil, Argentina, that area. But that is also going on a sliding road. And in fact, people feel that any further increases will have environmental issues concerned in Latin America, basically destroying some of the forest. That gives Africa as a possible potential area where if we had things where they will actually contribute to the increased agricultural output and feeding the world. But to do this, we must make significant investment, public investment, private sector investment to make things different. We must be able to deal with new issues that I think have been very well illuminated. The issue of health and nutrition that has become a major problem. The hidden hunger and all those other problems we need to deal with it. We must work on policy issues. Yes, we have the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. Yes, we have our science agenda for agriculture in Africa. We have the CISA framework in Africa. I think very, very useful policies. We now need to see how we can better harness those policies. And finally, in terms of possible interventions, we can look at the issue of organizing partnerships. Be able to take things to scale, sharing experiences, become very important. And finally, it's important to recognize that certain changes are taking place. And we need to go through that. When you begin to see Ethiopia making dramatic changes, beginning to be able to feed itself. When you begin to see countries that are trying to powerless Rwanda, moving from that poverty and excess, and now becoming one of those food sector countries, then I think there needs and issues that we can deal with. And then we must address issues. There are challenges to improve growth. Definitely the issue of environment, the issue of climate change. They are also where we really water. These are things we must do. It's not simply about increasing productivity, but we must be the potential impact in actions that we do. So those are some of the things that science must help us to deal with. So what do I see as in terms of moving forward? One is that we must work out the mechanism of improving food distributions. And dealing with some pending issues, supplementation of harnessing power of gender, how do we make sure that we are very strong in in our approaches. But also we must deal with the issue of reducing waste. I think this is an increasing issue. And I see that Europe has made a much significant effort in trying to deal with how we harness reducing other aspects of it. And then overall, we must be working towards strengthening their benefits. Again, the slides above tells you some of the issues, just emphasis, where the potentials are, what we need to improve, things like marketing, strengthening the marketing, strengthening the research capacity, strengthening the human capital, and also strengthening the institutional frameworks. And then this is how can we harness some of the necessary power that is available and the capacity that is available within the South African research system. I'm very keen when we're talking about the research chairs. I'm very keen to see that the research chairs in South Africa are linked to some of the research chairs that we would like to establish across the continent. I would like to see that. I would like to see cross-continental research issues. We are currently promoting academic mobility across the continent. How can we strengthen that so that the African student becomes like a European student? He or she knows what is happening in another continent. I think those are things we need to do. But we must also address the gap. I think what slide highlights a few things. We must deal with the issue of enhancing self-funding, and that is among others, apart from sound environment, fertilizing use rate, also strengthening again the investment in research, station, and innovation, and then strengthening infrastructure development of the continent. I think that means that this is where we are making progress in terms of infrastructure development. There's very, very significant progress, and I think within probably the next 10 years, we should be doing things there. I've already talked about the government policies. We need South Africa policies, South Africa focus on part of what I call our colleagues, global partners, partners who are investing down like South Africa with strong research capacity, how you can work with the rest of Africa to be able to answer capacity to deal with issues of strengthening their differences, but also dealing with cyber attacks. So, I would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, Pan-Africa and the rest of the world. But the cancer is enormous. It's not about protection. It's enormous. It's about protection. We must now work with the agri-tech pioneers to really work with the farmers who are no longer the farmers that who are willing to harness technology. We must cut out waste and harness things like solar energy, microprocessing, and others. We must cut entrepreneurs and innovators to realize the benefits. We must strengthen the food value chains, look at the issues of harnessing science by verification and all of that. And I think the work that was done by SIP and others in bringing things like the raw fish, sweet potatoes, that have had a remarkable impact. I think those are things we need to do. But we must have about the skills and policies to make us take advantage of the opportunities. So the key actions, number one, invest in young people and grow a few of the not everybody who is looking at the Let's just get a few that are interested, that are highly motivated to get involved. But we need to make that track. Second, we must invest very significantly in research and innovation as a key to translating the potential to reality. Finally, policy and environment needs to be very good. It needs to promote regional integration and important public opportunities. Fourth, human capital. Human this I can say. But I'll some few persons. What about 10 years of discussion on this presentation? Many persons have taken around 8 persons for comments on what advanced information. One, network. Two, centralization. One, what is that? Look at the network also that they want. Network. Okay, what's the focus of one person now asking Raymond to focus on question now? I'm sure that there's a working one. Oh, okay. We can just keep reminding me that the mics on the side of phone, whoever asks the question, we can do whatever. In case you are not able to move that point, you have a working one. Thank you for something inspiring presentation. My name is Mighty Mamu from International Security Initiative. Politics is becoming a very important part of the world. Why the political system is supposed to be some kind of veil to assist us as citizens. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is that as much as we can do strategies and plans about how to develop the country, it's quite unfortunate that the issue of policies are determined by some of the people who don't even care understanding of what the center entails. We can talk about investment in but now when we have people that are not actually assisting us in that regard. You can end up having all these beautiful researches, but you find that with some kind of leaders who don't think progressive. So when we lack of honest and progressive leadership, you can look at South Africa, for example. You have Land Bank that was actually championing development of the policy, but the bank today is turned into another commercial bank on the outside of the state. Now, the challenge that we have is that we let earners and progressive leadership assist in that regard. And so when we look at examples, the success of the African community was supposed to be something that the current leadership is very wrong. But unfortunately, things have changed. We invested in, but the challenge is that the policies are determined by people that have a very limited knowledge in terms of what they are saying. So much. My name is Next one, yes. Last one. Okay, you can ask. Okay, there's another one. Okay, it's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. It's okay. Yeah, you can ask.
My name is Christine Andre. I am Foreign Policy Advisor with Breaking Law Institute based in Washington, D.C. My question was what Professor Kafka said, so I think I'll comment instead. But I just want to emphasize more the need for advocacy. I hope that one thing we will leave from this conference is really think about how to make sure that all of the wonderful things that we have done, all of them, is not small things. But I think we've been talking about this for way too long. For some reason, we are all smiling and understand the challenges. But at the same time, we assume that our politicians will, for some reason, just take action and implement our positions. We know that that's not the case. I'll just give an example. Back to the world's job in Washington, D.C. is really to educate policymakers in Washington, provide the evidence base for why it's important to policy programs, and provide funding for to address all these challenges that we're talking about. So I just want to know to what extent we are all committed to connecting the research and evidence we're providing with action information into a broader audience that can take this to offices in our respective countries. And I think that has to come from the ground up as well. Much of our research perhaps gets to ministries, but people at the grassroots really have nothing to work with. So how do we know what policymakers are doing?
In this class, right now, last question, for that some are very difficult land issues. They're always difficult, and it's not in South Africa. Even when they come up, how to fight this land with land because they think I have too much land. So it's an issue. But I think first, let's congratulate Patrick for South Africa. How to maintain a harmony and then the issue. You may not have solved it 100%, but at least you have made progress in that regard. You're not going to have that. That's the side of it. But what you'd like to do is make sure that land creates opportunity for jobs, for business, and provides food that can adequately feed the life part of the population. I think we need, if you can really have that plan and make sure it is support the wider community, that will be excellent. But how you deal with it, I hope it will become like Zimbabwe. I'm sorry about that, but I hope that you manage this in a much better and more sound way. Nevertheless, the issue is how we make land available more sustainably, productive, taking into account the environmental issues, making sure that whatever is being done is responding to ensure that we are what we have the market, but also ensure that we are sustainable. And I think that is the challenge that we have. To do that, again, it comes back to policies. And I think this is where particularly those of us who are coming from universities, I think we have to do a lot much more to inform policy and often in the process that influence policies. Often, I feel like the University of Western Cape as a program on land issues or something less than that issue. I think we need to strengthen those institutions that they can provide policy guidance to the rest of the community. Now, what that we normally use in space, how do we make agriculture? First, we have said we all need to say that agriculture is simply about and not look at other things. We have the issue of trying to get innovations and with agriculture. You will not get innovation, innovative from this situation. We expected a lot more to come from the IT and all that. But with excellent submissions from South Africa, how do we try to read clear agriculture so that it becomes non-similar, but it is something that they also combine with the ITs in their policy. In a way, the same thing. Now, what is the how South Africa is the side station of engagement. I think that but I think there are programs in what is justice and free state. African program where I think the university is engaging with communities to transfer knowledge from the university from other sectors so that it reaches the community. In Kenya, we have a program that has been university there and the university are beginning as the extension mechanism so that you actually have a mechanism of putting knowledge from the universities and putting it in practice together with the extension departments and all that. So I think this is a policy issue of how do we handle our training program, how do we handle our research, to make sure that the output of this research and training can actually feed and support those who are engaged with those who are
Thank you very much, Prof. Akbar. I know a lot of people have wanted to ask questions, but in this interest of time, it will not be Prof. Akbar will be here and also interact with him. Before I hand over to my colleague, the next chapter, Joyce, if you can just give the last round of applause to Thank you very much. Don't forget to tweet and Facebook about the food security, agriculture, and also the food security. So, thank you very much. I'm also tweeting by the way.
Good morning once again. We are now going to move to our second speaker this morning, who will be addressing us on food system issues. I think from all the other speakers, it's quite clear that the system of delivering our food is at a tipping point. We all had breakfast this morning. None of us made from our little food garden behind our tables. The food was delivered by a system. We can recall the price surges of about 10 years ago on food prices. And it's quite worrying that we're talking about 2050 as the horizon for the next point to work towards delivering food for humans on the earth. But there's new data that's saying this might happen even closer. In 10 years' time or so, we have another crisis. And it will be more related to the structural issues that are failing to deliver the amount of food we need and the system around it. So this morning we're privileged to be addressed by somebody who has spent many decades working on the systems of food production, particularly smallholder production. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Ken Miller. Professor Ken Miller is a plant production systems professor from the University of Northern Ireland. His research focuses on smallholder farming systems in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly issues regarding soil fertility and the urbanization. He works with tropical legumes, among other things. He also leads a large-scale initiative called N2 Africa, focusing on putting nitrogen back into the soil. Professor Ken's current focus is on the future of farming as it relates to sustainable intensification, farm size, and the aging farmers. He's a current member of Unilever Sustainable Resource Advisory Board since 2012 and a senior fellow at UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge, United Kingdom. He joined Rugby in 2001. So please welcome
Phenomenal. That's the nice little stuff. This is
Thanks so much for being here. What a pleasure to be here and to be given this honor. So we've all heard about food systems this morning. I chose this time. I'll talk about something that's a global trend in farming, sustainable certification in Africa. I want to address an issue that's very close to my heart. What is a sustainable farm sector? Some examples from history. I touch on what I call food security conundrum, and then we'll think about it. We've heard about the sustainable development goals, and of course, SDG 2 is prominent in the hunger, achieve food security, promote sustainable agriculture. But these are goals which are inextricably interrelated. They're aspirational goals, and we've only got 13 years left to actually achieve them. This report, State of Food Security and Nutrition, came out a couple of months ago, and it's the first time that the report actually focuses on conflict, and it's the first time that we've seen a worrying increase in food insecurity, going the wrong direction. And this harks back to something which was already mentioned in Professor Alfal's talk, that these sudden food price surges triggered conflict in more than 40 countries. If we extrapolate that, food prices have been going down, nothing like the levels that they were in 2004 to 2005. And I think we have to ask this question, well, has conflict actually declined with it? The problems of conflict and food security, of course, are in the Middle East, in the Horn of Africa, South Sudan. And these food price spikes have got global impacts. This is this famous red payment from Egypt, when wheat prices went so high, triggered food prices, and they were actually the source of the Arab Spring. So food security is really a political issue. Professor Adepala actually showed the update from this. Is his graph from 2014 of the world's population. Now I want to highlight the extra billion people by 2030, particularly the uncertainty around those predictions will be forced. If we look at then the world population, we're going to have extra billion people by 2030 when we should be achieving the sustainable development goals. We're now projected to 9.2 billion by 2050, so we will be talking about in the past now, it's already 9.8 billion and rising. With that increasing population, with an increase in Africans, then we also see an increase in food demand in Africa. This is an excellent paper. They tell us province where you can see on the north of Africa, the capita calorie demand, and you can see that as the countries rises, then basically calorie demand goes up. So we're very uncertain about how much food we'll need in the future. Estimates of 50% more food, doubling of food, but we need them to address those in different ways. We need to reduce losses, we maybe need to change diets and reduce demands, and we need to increase production. So despite this rapid urbanization we're actually going to see Africa's rural population growing enormously as well. And Africa really beats every continent on these statistics. The speed with which populations are growing, both rural and urban, is really dramatic. And what we've seen in China and in India, we've seen a plateauing in terms of the rural population. India, we've seen the rural population plateauing very soon. In Africa, the rural population will continue to grow. Now, if you think about this global food system, there are several parts of the world which are shown in the dark red, which are really net food exporters. There are those in paler colours, which are the food importers. And this goes together with this report, which also came out a month ago back, which is the Global Hunger Index. It's 2017, and we're still facing huge numbers of people facing hunger. I want to talk about the farm often talk organic, agroecological, traditional, indigenous, alternative family farms. And that's often put up against what's called industrial, large-scale, conventional farms. But I don't know how we really define conventional agriculture. Most of these terms are very close to that. Almost all farms, and I'd say 99% of farms in the world, are actually conventional family farms. So I want to talk today about what I call mainstream agriculture. I think we can learn a lot from agroecologists, a lot from the organic movement, but I want to talk about farming. So farming depends very simply on labour, on land, and on capital. And in this graph, taken from the Journal paper, Food Security, that we did in response to the year of family farming, what we've plotted is on the vertical axis, capital availability against land availability. And if we go to areas left-hand top corner, where we've got capital availability and low land availability, we see an intensification in small farms, particularly what we see very much in Europe, where farms become increasingly capital intensive. At the top right-hand corner, you'll see what's happening in continents like Australia, but also in South America. It's an expansion of farms to larger and larger units, very capital intensive. What we see in Africa, particularly in areas with low land availability, is what we call marginalisation. Marginalisation is increasing farm sizes. So here we are in Australia. This is a photo from about very efficient agriculture on very large farms. As my colleague from Cyrus, Vijay, says the biggest problem for farmers in Australia is they can't find land. The farmers are so far apart, the young women don't want to marry the farmers. Farmers are really so prerogative. Farming is an enterprise, it's a family enterprise, and we scale this slide to Will Marsden. You can see here farmers have 1 to 3 family members and less than 1 employee in the farm. So you've got less than 1 employee, people are farming often 1,000 to 5,000 hectares. So very capital intensive, very labour intensive. We face this thing with farmers getting older. This is from a whole range of countries. Farmers 65 years or older. And we see this in Africa as well. Africa's aging farm. The difficulty of inheritance due to the fact that investment in farming or the problem of the lack of interest in farming very often in the countries of Africa. I want to mention, first of all, something that this idea of the yield gap. So this is from the Yield Gap Atlas, led by Kate Picasso and Martin Mason, who are here today. So we look at Europe, and it looks pretty green. We're achieving something in the order of 90% of the potential yields in those areas. You can see if you move more to the east of Europe, things are not quite as rosy, where basically there's less capital investment. When we look at Africa, and Africa for the countries that have been studied is really very red. We're only achieving 10 to 20% of the potential yield. And yet, this is a slide actually from the 90s from Australia. You see one of them is doing Zimbabwe and I think that's there. And you can see that we know how to close those yield gaps. That's a very poor sampling model. And we've got a crop producing something like half a ton of milk with a crop density.
So it's supposed to
And I've spent most of my career looking at these wonderful plants, the nitrogen fixing elements. They can modulate and they can capture nitrogen from the atmosphere to provide food directly into the food soil. And in 2008, I was asked together with farmers to develop this project. It's a place for them to nitrogen to work for the smallholder. So the aim is then to improve agricultural productivity, grain legumes, and the crops that come after them to improve nutrition and food security, to promote legumes as cash crops and then to build national capacity. Because our farmers
You recording that?
fill this technology pipeline for development. So our overall research question, using tools of farming systems is what works where, why, when, and so on. We do that from the level of the field to the farm, up to the country, and down. And when we're thinking about farmers, we've got technologies first of all. We've got farmer diversity, we have environmental factors which determine the technology's suitability, we have farm factors and types which basically come together to create this idea of the technology map. So the technology map we can think of as the square peg and the square hole. When they match at the right size, we've got a technology that works. When we have a round peg and we're trying to force it into the square hole, the technology is not working. And these environmental factors that we've got are also very important in shaping farmer diversity, in shaping the farm factors. So using this approach, farming beans in northern Rwanda, beans were introduced into Africa in the 16th century from Latin America and South America, along with maize, and they've traveled together ever since.
No, no, I've got these. So I don't
What you see here now is farming
think to listen.
well, actually, what we found is very few pockets in northern Rwanda and in DRC, but in the very high ones. Here we are, around 2,300 meters above sea level. It's very high up. That means that it's a cooler climate, and these beans actually take much longer to grow and develop than the bush beans. If we go back to the 1970s, what we have found is 90% or more of the landscape will be covered with bush beans, with short beans, and just a very, very few fields of farming. So, on small farms here in the Rwandan Highlands, what better way of intensifying fertility? And here we've got examples really of fantastic research that's done to introduce these beans into Africa. I stand in the field and I'm no midget. I can't reach the top of the beans there on the right, which are fed there with manure and phosphorus. But when we take it out to smallholder farms, we find very variable results. Now on the horizontal axis there, we've got climbing bean yield with just the manure. On the vertical axis, we have that with climbing bean yield with manure and phosphorus. Now, what you'll see, most of the points are above the line, which means that phosphorus is the limit. What we see overall is a difference in yields between different kinds of crops. And here we see the farm being differentiated into those who are really very poor small farms, those who are wealthy. And we see big increases in yields over those. And when we look at the soils, we find that I highlight the soil carbon and phosphorus. We see that the poor farmers have actually got very poor soils in terms of the carbon and phosphorus content compared to the wealthy farmers. And this is essentially due to the fact that the poorer farmers don't have access to their own manure, so they don't have the nutrients in the manure to be able to maintain the soil fertility in their field. But we can also differentiate this in relation to the state density and the state height, because basically you need those as well to get the beans to grow vertically. So poor farmers essentially have got fewer, shorter states of inferior quality. So in our work, we are able then to differentiate all of these different agronomic factors and soil fertility factors, which derive whether or not the farm is able to get a good improvement in yield. And understanding those constraints allows us to feedback to tailor those technologies to different households. So in an iterative, participatory way, we're looking to develop a broad basket of options that different farmers can use. When it works well, we have bigger system benefits. On the right there, there's some ways after climate means compared to maize following maize. And in into Africa, we've been working now across these different countries and reaching more than 600,000 farmers. And we do this using a public-private partnership approach, using a whole range of different farmers. This is one example of looking at chickpea farming in the barley area, working with 10,000 smallholder growers, strengthening the seed systems, looking at the input supply and the market. And huge enthusiasm from the farmers, and this is actually a large number of guys, but we also realize we're running up against constraints, so these value chain approaches aren't working very regularly. This is now from Western Kenya. Vihiga is an area of very dense population. What's shown in the blue, these are farms basically ranked in farm size and ranked like 100 farms. In the blue is the land that the farm is using for the food security. The green is an area that they can resource the agriculture. The red is the land on very small farms that they will need to actually feed the family. And these are what we call these farm land grants. So instead of just renewing them, we also have the farm land grant in terms of insufficient area to feed the family. And we say that small farms and small soils come together as a form of a double option farm for smallholder. In Migori, where there's no land available, and of course there we can think about investing in value chains to allow farmers to use the market. We pulled together data here from 30,000 farms across 93 sites in 17 countries. And when we look here on the vertical axis, everything's there converted into food. So simply to look at food self-sufficiency, we find that 37%, nearly 40% of households across that 30,000 farms are actually food insecure. What can we do for farmers on very small farms? These are two farms in South Kivu, Congo. What the farmers are holding in their hands is their livestock. When we ask what organic matter we had to put in the soil, that's what they had to collect for dropping through these guinea pigs. When that's put in the pocket of soil, you can see that we actually get a change from a couple of hundred kilos per hectare yield of beans up to something in the order of half a ton per ton. It's not much, but it's enough to actually help them in another month or so of food self-security. We have technologies like the short duration cow feed by Samsung, which yields actually shorter than 100 kilos. It allows for 2 crops within one season, and it provides them the energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins to actually boost the diet. These two labour farmers are actually developing the seed industry, early adopters, multiplying the seed and selling their neighbours. So breeding's come up with some fantastic varieties which will also help farmers with their nutrition on poor farms. But it really led us to raise this question, well, what's a sustainable farm? And I go here back to an example. This is in Usambara Mountains in northeast Tanzania, where I had my first project in Africa. That was in 1987. You can see the market on the left in 1987, and on the right in 2014, with beans being an important commodity being sold there. Here in 1987, we were doing experiments looking at the very poor soil fertility. On the right, there's participating in picnic selection with one of the Director African Reviews. In 1987, there am I standing in the field in Western Zimbabwe. Here I'm standing
program has taken data from a Roma survey from 2015, and we've looked at the current income in the poverty line. And even if you put the non-farm income, we've only got something in the order of 35 to 40% of the farmers above the poverty line. Is that acceptable? In 2017, we were talking about measuring against the poverty line. And we started thinking about this idea of living income. So living income is being used in the commodities, particularly around cocoa, coffee, and wine, particularly how you actually pay farm workers and farmers. So it's a net to give a decent standard of living. What does that basically mean? In our own country, we think the basic human rights, from the Declaration of Human Rights, 25 and 26, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to education and healthcare. So those come together to give us a living income. And when we calculate that here for two examples from Anchor and Anchor from the plantation work in Kenya and Malawi, and we've calculated for Lushoto in the situation with local education or with private education, which is what everybody alludes to. Instead of a $1.9 a day purchasing price parity, we come out with around $7 a day, legally to achieve those basic human rights, with something in the order of 50% of the expenditure of households on food, and if you include then the private education, that goes down. So the public education, of course, is the government school, the private is where everybody wants to send their children because they want to work for them. And if you put in the living income threshold there, translated back into Tanzanian shillings, you see that there's a very small proportion of farmers who actually reach that living income. We went further with this to look at the role of crops and crop income, so the role from agriculture, excluding the off-farm income. And you can see here that vegetables in the purple are quite important in the Usambara Mountains. But again, for the poverty line and for the living income line, we'll see that cropping is bringing us nowhere near a decent standard of living on the farm sizes that we're looking at. We've only got 13% actually above the poverty line in this area. And we're talking here about one of the agroecologies with 2 crops per year, which is one of the most favorable agroecologies for farming on small holdings in Africa. If we turn that around, we can look then at the proportion of farmers who would be above the poverty line with current yields, and you can see it's a small proportion as I showed in the slide before. And if we actually close the yield gaps to 50% of water limited yield, and that would be going from 1 ton of grain of maize up to about 5 tons per hectare, you can see we're only elevating 40% of farmers above the poverty line and very few above this living income threshold. We can look at that in terms of the land required. So in Lushoto, current farm sizes are about 0.4 hectares. With current yields, you'd actually need nearly 3.5 hectares to achieve the poverty line. We need 15 hectares. 15 hectares to reach a level of a decent income. There's data there also from another site in Nyando, where farm sizes are larger and population pressure isn't quite so large, where we're also looking at a need of something in the order of 7 to 8 hectares to provide a living income. I want to go back to a historical message here, because when I was working in the West Usambaras, I came across a historical thesis which went back to 1890. And basically this quote then, from those days, the mountains of what I call the Fuga Plateau are almost bare, the bad soil, the land so densely occupied, this could no longer be possible. 1912, the Malthusian crisis. In 1945, low fertility, overcultivation, we need soil rehabilitation. In the middle there, every new baby is an added burden which can no longer be born. 1946. And now in 2014, we're still looking at soil erosion as the major problem. We're looking at implementing climate-smart agriculture. But what's happened? Population's actually gone from 70,000 to over 500,000 people in that area, and yet there's been no Malthusian disaster. There's a painting from 1900, a slide I took in '89, a slide I took of the Vuga Plateau in 2015, and it's actually more densely treed now than it was before. So what's going on? What's happening in these rural communities? Why haven't we seen this Malthusian crisis? Well, we see this incredible livelihood diversification. The staple crops on rain-fed land, where we are up in the top right-hand corner, they're important. Farmers still crop them for food, but they lack investment because the focus is on vegetable production in the valleys. And those vegetables go every night around midnight down to Dar es Salaam, 4 hours away, to be sold in the markets there. Nearly every household is relying on remittances from people working off farm in what we call circular migration, often people who come back to the farm later on. And we have these houses here on the left bottom corner with satellite dishes to receive DSTV, these beautiful Doric columns at the front. And all of that investment is coming from outside the area. And yet the population there is going to double again within the next 20 years. This idea that farming relies on off-farm income, it's not restricted just to peri-urban areas. In Prof. Adipala's home country, if we go here and we look at those remoter areas up in the north, east, the Karamojong, they're very dependent on off-farm income. We tend to think of these rural households as being farmers, but they're dependent on much more. And here also from Uganda, this is looking at how farmers react after climate shocks. What do? Off-farm remittances is the first way that people cope with climate change when it happens. The second there is for those who have them, they sell livestock. And those who don't have livestock, who tend to be the poor, they eat less. And these are already the least food secure. This is really a terrible situation, I think. So what's happening elsewhere? In Ethiopia, we've been looking at these beautiful traditional home gardens with enset, the false banana, coffee, wonderfully diverse production systems. But what's happening is that farmers like this farmer and his family, who are living on 0.2 hectares of land, are going over to cash cropping. And this is cash cropping of chat, myrrh, agilis, the narcotic which is sold into the Middle East. Here, sold off every day, rushed to be flown out. It's the fourth most important foreign exchange earner in Ethiopia now. And I'm not promoting this, please don't get me wrong. But if you're a smallholder farmer with 0.2 hectares and you have this lucrative opportunity to feed the family and educate the kids on 0.2 hectares of land, I really question what would you do. So there are some other trends going on, which really comes from the work of Tom Jane. I think quite inspirational work, where he's talking about a change in farming, the emergence of these investor farmers, with areas of 5 to 50 to 100 hectares. But these tend to be urban households who can often own up to 35% of the land in different areas. They're forcing land prices up. This is forcing an investment in agriculture, but they're often using a small proportion of their land initially. But of course they can help maybe to stimulate the local market. So we're not sure really where this will lead, but it's really a bit of elite capture from the urban population who are actually expanding into agriculture. So I want to use another historical example. Which country was successful in achieving food self-sufficiency? They had policies to support modernization, using new technologies, consolidated fragmented fields. They had policies to encourage unviable farmers to quit. They had tariffs and price support to provide a living income, back to this idea of the living income for farmers. And they had special measures for farmers on poor sandy soils, and it was all funded by foreign aid. And the answer is, well, it's my adopted country, the Netherlands, after the war. And this guy, Mansholt, was the architect of the Common Agricultural Policy, with help from the Marshall Fund to invest in this idea of reducing the number of small farms, of consolidating land, modernizing agriculture, turning farming into a motor for economic growth. But this happened by reduction of the number of farms dramatically through migration, many people leaving Europe for Australia or the New World. Industrialization and urbanization, so pulling people off the land into the urban centers, into industrial jobs. Prof. Adipala already referred to migration, and I wonder if we're about to see one of the biggest migrations we've ever seen in the history of mankind in future from Africa. But if we look at EU subsidies and farmers' income, and I was looking for data on this, and this was a newspaper article last week in the Netherlands, what you have in the yellow dots is the average income of all professions, and then in the bars we've got the income of farmers in all the different EU countries with and without the EU subsidy. So the EU is spending 50 billion euros a year on subsidies. But in Africa, we're not allowed to do things like that. I have to say that that 50 billion euros in subsidy, actually only a very small proportion goes to farmers. Much goes to actually companies and other players in the value chains and not the farmers directly. But it paints a pretty bleak picture of farming overall. Farming is not a lucrative profession, more or less anywhere. And what the farmers in the Netherlands do, they're diversifying. Wind energy and windmills is now one of the biggest earners for farmers in terms of their overall livelihood portfolio. So yes, Africa, population growth is showing no sign of slowing down. If we plot then the latest figures, you'll see from that median from 2014, the mean projection, we're now way above that. And actually population growths are actually rising, as Prof. Adipala said earlier. If we think about self-sufficiency in Africa and we close yield gaps, then you'll see that most of these countries, even if we go to 50% of the water limited yield, are still below that line of food self-sufficiency. Only a few countries can get above it with 80% of water limited yield. But this is without land expansion, and that was a key point which Prof. Adipala made, that we're unlikely to feed the population of Africa without land expansion. So this is, if you like, a bleak picture. We've got inspirational leaders like Akin Adesina, who chose this title of Betting on Africa to Feed the World in his speech when he received the World Food Prize. We need this inspirational leadership, but we need to couch it in some of the realism, I think, with Prof. Adipala provided this morning. So what I'd like to present to you as I start to conclude is this idea of a food security conundrum. We need national food security that requires an abundant supply of cheap and nutritious food to feed the burgeoning urban population. We need that in every country in the world. Agriculture is also a major contributor to the balance of payments for many African economies. So they need to actually export food or other agricultural commodities to earn income to actually keep the country going in terms of importation of fuel and everything. And yet rural households, smallholder farmers, maybe instead of investor farmers, I call them the reluctant farmers, they lack sufficient land or economic incentives to invest in agriculture. So I finish with some conclusions and some questions. I think we can certainly conclude that global food security is a key geopolitical issue. We have an abundance of technologies that are available for sustainable intensification. I and many colleagues in this room have worked on these for years. They work beautifully, but they don't actually make people rich if you only have a small piece of land. Farmers are having to diversify to make a living income. And that means often having a broad portfolio of activities, off-farm and on-farm. Off-farm income and/or subsidies, they appear to be key for economic farming virtually everywhere in the world, with the exception, I think, of the continent of Australasia, so Australia and New Zealand, who managed to do without, but with very, actually, highly technical and very efficient farming. And the capital needed for farming tends to come from outside the farm, whether that's coming from relatives living in the city who are bringing money back to the farm, or whether it's coming from investment through microfinance or banking or whatever. And I think the take-home message is really we can't imagine that rural development can be independent of urbanization and urban employment. We need those to go hand in hand to be able to develop agriculture. So we need the development of a productive urban sector to employ people in future. And I leave you then with this question, which is one that I really wonder about. Who will produce our food? Thank you very much.
I'm sure you agree we've been given a wealth of the complexity of the system, and it's time to ask questions or give comments. What I'd like to suggest is to first give a round of applause to Prof. Ken Giller again. And to ask that if you have questions, please line up behind the mics on the side. We will be able to go quicker. We have between 5 and 7 minutes before our tea break. Can I ask that if you have a question, you line up behind the mic, and let's take those questions and comments. Please line up behind the mics if you have a question, instead of raising your hand. Yeah. Just 3 people behind the mic and then we should be done. Can I start with you, sir?
Me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Wiringanga. I'm from University of Cape Town, but I'm a Kenyan citizen. I'm studying computer science. Okay, my question is, right now we have a lot of analytics concerning the big data science, and the problem with the big data science and technology is that it is only assisting and promoting the big firms. Those are the people who are able to use the data or are able to read the analytics. Now my question is, how can we be able to use this big data in order to promote the small farmer or the small-scale farmer who is in the rural areas? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the second question.
Thanks for the presentation, Ken. That was magnificent. A comment and a question, though. I think we do need to be careful when we talk about population growth and how do we manage population growth. In most countries in Africa, the total fertility rate is declining, and in many countries it's around 2.3. That means that the reason why Africa's population keeps on growing is because there were so many young people born 20 years ago and are now entering the age of sexual reproductive age. So in some senses, there's not much more that we can do about managing population growth. One exception. If we want to do much about anything, including population growth, the key there is educating women and empowering women. So that's the comment. The question is, I think the analysis you pointed to is quite correct. In order to be able to invest in farm, in order to be able to farm, farmers need off-farm income. Any experience that you might have had where that off-farm income has come from social protection policies? In other words, where the urban employed are taxed and through cash transfers, either through grants to children or grants to older people, those grants are then become a way in which farmers can invest in their land. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Yeah, I think the one on big data, I mean, I think that this is an interesting era, and one of the ways that we're working in Enter Africa, many others as well, is with the idea of potentially using, we use farm radio in Tanzania, for instance, to push out messages, but then getting farmers to text in, and once we have their coordinates, we can actually do surveys of working out what farmers actually want to have in the agro-dealers and put them together with agro-dealer networks. So a two-way, if you like, feeding messages out, getting messages back in, and then actually using that as a way of creating these broader databases so that we can assist companies in providing the inputs that farmers want at the right time ahead of the season. So I do think that there are some really interesting developments there. For Julian May's point on population growth, I fully accept what you're saying, and if we read the 2017 World Population Report, it introduces a new concept which wasn't there in the previous ones, which they call population momentum, and they calculate that by dropping the birth rate to replacement rates immediately, and then seeing, well, what effect does this large young population have on the future growth. And basically that says that 65% of that 11.2 billion people are already going to be there. 65% due to this youth that we have in Africa. And that's what people are talking about, the potential dividend, the population dividend, if we can harness it properly. But it basically does mean that whatever we do about trying to slow down population growth now, it'll have a moderate effect at most. Your question on cash transfers, I'm afraid I don't know of any examples, but I do know in the discussions I've had, particularly with Will Masters, I mean, in Tufts University, he's very much a proponent of using that sort of mechanism, but actually using maybe interventionist cash transfers through food for work schemes and the like, rather than subsidizing fertilizers, as ways to both improve rural infrastructure at the same time as basically getting money into the cash economy in rural areas. So I think that is an interesting area that needs exploring.
Thank you, Professor. Can I take your question and then him, and we should be able to close. Thanks.
Thank you. Marta Rivera from the Chair of Agroecology and Food Systems in the University of Vic in Spain. I want to raise, you said that farming is not a lucrative activity, profession. I think we all agree, but I'm wondering if we are talking about paradigm shifts, I wonder whether it shall be. For instance, to study medicine, you know it's not a lucrative profession. You provide a service to the society. It's a well-recognized profession, and you study because you want to provide this service. So farming is the key activity to provide the right to food, which is very close to the right to life. And so if we change our paradigm about farming, I wonder whether we should consider it as a lucrative profession or not.
Okay, I'm John Mumba from Zambia. I work for SNV, Netherlands Development Organization. The presentation by Prof, where I was trying to link the value chain, food security, living income, I don't seem to see the gap here, because in my little work as a field worker, an extensionist, is that even if the living income perhaps may have to improve at the household level, I've seen a lot of individual household dynamics at the household level, that the living income does not actually translate to improve the livelihood at the household level because of certain dynamics. May I perhaps find out from Prof if he has taken any kind of research to see how dynamics at household level affects the food security vis-a-vis the living income at household level. Because in my country, in my little experience as an extensionist, I've seen that even when there's bumper harvest, for lack of a better word, at the household level, among the poor, it does not translate into improved living standard because of certain dynamics, perhaps where the head of a household does not channel the resource to good nutrition or to better living at household. In short, perhaps because the male seems to have much control of the resource. And so even when there's bumper harvest, even when they've got enough income, it's not always true that this is translated into productive use at the household level. Rather, it's spent on other issues like alcohol drinking and prostitution and stuff like that. May I hear from the Prof with experience regarding this? Thank you.
Thank you. Can answer.
Yeah, the first question, I mean, I think your point about farming, essentially what you're saying is that farming is a vocation, and I think that's true. In the same way that I think working for a university in education, as I do, is a vocation. It's not just about drawing our salary, it's actually about having a huge commitment to that. And I think that's true for many farmers. Farmers see themselves very often as the custodians of the land. But again, they have to make ends meet, and they want their children to do well. And one of the big problems that we see, particularly in Europe, in inheritance of farms, is for one thing that people have more than one child, and they often want to be able to split their inheritance between those children, which makes a problem for the viability of their farm. But particularly the capital costs and the capital invested in the farm is such that it makes inheritance very difficult. And we also see in situations where there are many people who want to get into farming, younger couples I've talked to with the Rabobank in the Netherlands, who are an agricultural cooperative bank originally, where basically they can't get into farming because of the capital costs of doing so. So that there are issues there, I think. On the one of the fact that just earning more money doesn't make a household better off in terms of their food and nutrition security, I'm afraid I've seen many examples of this as well, where particularly there's an important gender dimension about how money is spent. Particularly in Enter Africa, by working with women in our extension programs, we could actually show changes in household consumption of food. Whereas if we did the same extension through men, that led generally to greater sales. So that there's clearly a dimension there that we have to take into account when we're thinking about promoting agricultural technologies. But I'm afraid in terms of the social engineering, that's really a bit beyond my capacity, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Prof. Giller. I assume we have exhausted our questions for this session. Just one more quickly, please. Is there a mic? That's the final one we'll take.
I've been working for the last 65 years as smallholders in Africa. My last formal job was as principal agriculturist for Africa in the World Bank. I now live in a village in Malawi. Prof made considerable reference to the yield gap between Asia and Europe and Africa. There was much less comment on the fertilizer gap, and I wish he'd said a little bit more about that. China has maize yields 4 times greater than those of Malawi. Its fertilizer use per hectare is 15 times greater than that of Malawi. India, as you know, has doubled its grain yields in 15 years under the Green Revolution, but once again, it's had a 75% subsidy on all nitrogenous fertilizer for 62 years. And the Prof just said we're not allowed to subsidize fertilizer in Africa, and yet without the subsidies which have increased yields all over the rest of the world, we can expect that shortage of plant nutrients, particularly nitrogen, despite the legumes, is going to be the major limiting factor on African agriculture over the coming years. And if we're not allowed to subsidize it, what does he suggest that we should do, given that we know that legumes cannot make up for all the nitrogen that's being lost.
Thank you.
No, thanks, Stephen. The question's from Stephen Carr. And I spent actually a few days in May this year in Stephen's house debating these issues at length, and forgive me for not making that clear. I mean, I was wrong when I said that we aren't allowed to subsidize in Africa because, of course, in a sense, I was harking back to that time in the 1990s with structural adjustment when there were no subsidies, and now, of course, there are subsidies in many countries in Africa, but not to the extent that can actually turn things around in terms of profitability for farmers. We had a very interesting session yesterday afternoon on sustainable intensification, where we were debating this issue of how to actually make farming more profitable, how to create those conditions, and recognizing that fertilizer subsidies directly are fairly imperfect instruments, but we don't necessarily know how to do it better, I think. But I fully agree with you that legumes can only do a certain amount in terms of boosting productivity. I devoted my career to looking at legumes, and I think they're a fantastic bonus. But beyond that, to get the cereal yields up that we need, there's clearly going to be a great need for more nutrients, and particularly nitrogen, as you say, although we're finding increasingly the need for balanced fertilization, as we call it, as other problems such as you know, the phosphorus and potassium and other things come in. As yields improve as well, and yields increase, we'll see more of that given the old soils that we deal with here in Africa. So thanks for pulling me up, Stephen, on that one.
On that note, I'd like to thank Prof. Giller and everyone who was here this morning. I think it's time now for a break for refreshments and parallel sessions from 11:30. Thank you.
So hot here. Ja.